The stars looked different from the space station, orbiting Kepler 442b, Kim Ji-won thought, as he stared out the window of his quarters. The human diplomat had been living on this neutral station for 3 weeks now, working day and night to create something that had never existed before real peace between humans and the Valak's empire. Back on Earth, his wife Soo-young was taking care of their 2 children. 8-year-old Min Seo and 5-year-old Ji-hoon Ji-won missed them terribly, but he knew this work was important. More important than anything he had ever done in his life. If these talks succeeded, humanity would finally have a real place in the galaxy, instead of being treated like children or pets by the older alien races. The Valaks were different from other aliens Ji-won had met. They were tall and thin, with silver skin that seemed to shimmer under artificial lights. Their eyes were completely black, and when they spoke, their voices sounded like wind through metal pipes. Most humans found them frightening, but Ji-won had learned to see past their strange appearance. High Chancellor Vex, the lead Valak's negotiator, had shown himself to be reasonable and intelligent. Today had been a breakthrough day. After weeks of careful discussions, they had finally agreed on the main points of what would be called the Treaty of New Hope. The name had been Ji-won's idea, and Vex had liked it immediately. The treaty would establish trade routes between human and Valak space. It would set up rules for peaceful contact, and most importantly, it would recognize humanity as an equal partner in galactic affairs. But the part Ji-won was most proud of was the cultural exchange program. His idea was simple. Human children and Valak's children would learn about each other through video calls, school exchanges, and shared projects. It would take generations, but eventually fear and mistrust would be replaced by understanding and friendship. Vex had been moved by this idea. The tall alien had stood quietly for several minutes after Ji-won explained it. Then, in his strange, whistling voice, he had said this was the most hopeful thing he had heard in his long life. The Valaks lived much longer than humans, and Vex was over 300 years old. He had seen many wars and much suffering. The idea that future generations might grow up as friends instead of enemies made him believe the universe could be a better place. That evening, Ji-won video called his family back on Earth. Little Ji-hoon was excited to hear about the alien children he might soon meet. He asked if they had toys, like human children did, if they played games, if they liked stories. Min Seo wanted to know if she could teach them to play soccer. Soo-young just smiled and told her husband how proud she was of him. The treaty signing was scheduled for tomorrow morning. Representatives from both governments would arrive along with observers from the Galactic Council. It would be broadcast across human space and Valak's territory. A new chapter in galactic history would begin with the stroke of a pen. What Ji-won did not know was that not all Valaks wanted peace. A group of military leaders and nobles called the Pure Flame believed their species was superior to all others. They saw humans as barely evolved animals who had stumbled into space, travel through luck rather than wisdom. The idea of treating humans as equals made them sick with rage. General Koreks, leader of the Pure Flame, had been planning this moment. For weeks, his agents had infiltrated the space station security. His assassins were already moving through the corridors while Ji-won read poetry in his quarters. The human would die tonight, and with him any hope of peace between their species. The Pure Flame believed fear was better than friendship. Humans needed to know their place in the galaxy, and that place was far below the Valaks. They would make Ji-won's death a message that no human would ever forget at midnight station time. 3 Valaks. Assassins entered Ji-won's quarters using security codes provided by Pure Flame agents. The human diplomat was sitting in his reading chair with an old book of Korean poetry open in his lap. He looked up when they entered and for a moment seemed confused rather than afraid. "Are you here about tomorrow's ceremony?" he asked in careful Valak's language. He had been studying their speech for months and was proud of his progress. The lead assassin said nothing. He simply raised his weapon. a Valix plasma, blade that could cut through steel like paper. The other two spread out to block any escape route. Though the small quarters offered nowhere to run, Jiwon finally understood what was happening. He thought of his children, of his wife, of the future. He had worked so hard to build. "I only wanted peace," he said in Korean, knowing they would not understand. The killing was brutal and deliberate. The assassins wanted to send a clear message. They arranged Ji-won's body in the main conference room where the treaty was to be signed. They left a note written in broken English that said, "Humans would never be equals, only servants or enemies." By morning, the news had spread throughout the station. The Valix official delegation claimed shock and horror. But privately many were relieved. The humans were getting too bold, too confident. This would remind them of their true place. High Chancellor Vex was not part of the conspiracy. When he saw what had been done to Ji-won, he collapsed to his knees in grief. The human had been his friend, had shown him a vision of a better future. Now that future lay dead on a conference table surrounded by pools of dried blood. The images of Ji-won's body were transmitted to Earth within hours. President Park Min-ho received the news while eating breakfast with his own family. When he saw the pictures, he pushed his plate away and did not eat for the rest of the day. His advisors found him hours later, still staring at the reports, still trying to understand how someone could murder a man whose only crime was believing in peace. The funeral would be held on Earth in 3 days. But already something was stirring in human space. Something dark and ancient that had been sleeping since humanity first reached for the stars. The species that had conquered their own world through determination and unity was remembering why their ancestors had survived when larger, stronger creatures had not. Jiwon had wanted his children to meet alien children and learn about different cultures. Instead, his death would teach the galaxy a very different lesson about human culture. They would learn that humans never forgot those who wronged them, and they would learn that there was no fury in the universe like that, of a species that had been betrayed while extending friendship. The treaty that was never signed would be remembered as the last chance for peace. The war that followed would be remembered as the moment the galaxy learned to fear humanity. Admiral Lee Salmon had seen enough war to last 3 lifetimes. The veteran commander had fought in the Outer Colony rebellions when pirates tried to take control of the mining stations beyond Jupiter. She had commanded fleets during the Mars independence. War when the Red Planet tried to break away from Earth rule. She had negotiated ceasefires with hostile alien species and watched young soldiers die in battles over territory that meant nothing to anyone back home. But when she saw the images of Kim Ji-won's body broadcast across human space, something cold and hard settled in her chest. She remembered her own diplomatic missions to alien worlds, the way they looked at her like she was a curious animal that had learned to wear clothes and speak. The barely hidden contempt when they agreed to meetings they considered beneath their dignity. Now they had murdered a peacemaker, a man who had spent months learning their language, studying their culture, trying to build bridges between worlds. They had butchered him like an animal and left his body as a message. The message was clear. Humans would never be equals in their eyes. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session within 24 hours. Representatives from 47 different species gathered to discuss what they carefully called the Kepler Incident. Ambassador Chen Da-hyun represented humanity at the session. She had been Ji-won's friend and colleague. They had worked together on dozens of diplomatic missions, and she had been looking forward to celebrating the treaty signing with him. Instead, she sat in the great circular chamber and listened to species after species offer meaningless condolences. The Thoranian representative spoke of the need for calm. Reflection. The Zephyrian delegate called for patience while proper investigations were conducted. The Valix themselves claimed this was an internal security matter and refused to hand over those responsible. What made Chen truly angry was how relieved most of them seemed. The upstart humans had been put back in their place. The young species that had been gaining too much influence too quickly had been reminded of their position in the galactic hierarchy. Nobody said this directly, but she could. See it in their expressions, hear it in the careful way they avoided her eyes. Back on Earth, something unprecedented was happening. The funeral of Kim Ji-won became a rallying point that united humanity in a way that no previous event had achieved. From the underground cities of Mars to the floating research stations of Europa, from the generation ships heading for distant stars to the tiny outposts on moons, nobody had names for humans watched the ceremony and wept, but their tears were not just of sadness. They were tears of rage. President Park Min-ho stood at the podium in Seoul, looking out at a crowd of 10 million people. The funeral was being broadcast live to every human settlement in known space. His speech was simple and direct. We sent them our best man seeking friendship. They sent us back his corpse. The time for words is over. Dr. Yoon Tae-jin, head of the Human Defense Initiative, received authorization to begin projects that had been theoretical for decades. The Prometheus class battleships, humanity's most advanced warships, were recalled from patrol duties and sent to secret shipyards for retrofitting with experimental weapons. The Ghost Protocol, a black operations program that officially did not exist, was activated for the first time since the Mars War. But it was not just the military that mobilized civilian scientists, abandoned their research projects to work on military applications. Engineers designed new weapons and armor systems. Factory workers volunteered for extra shifts to increase production. Everyone wanted to contribute to what was becoming clear would be humanity's response. The phrase, "remember," Ji-won began appearing everywhere, carved into bulkheads, painted on walls, transmitted in coded messages. Between human ships and stations, it became a greeting, a farewell, a promise. Children who had never heard of the diplomat before his death were soon chanting his name in schoolyards. On Mars, General Ko Won-bin was put in charge of something called the Retribution Task Force. The name alone sent shivers through alien intelligence networks that had been monitoring human communications. Retribution was not a word other species used when discussing military operations. Most aliens fought for territory, resources, or strategic advantage. Humans apparently fought for something much more dangerous. The Valix Empire seemed completely unaware of the storm they had unleashed. Their military analysts dismissed human capabilities as inferior. Their politicians laughed at the idea of consequences from such a young and technologically primitive species. They had fought border skirmishes with humans before and always emerged victorious through superior numbers and better equipment. What they failed to understand was that they had awakened something that had been dormant in human hearts since their species first learned to make tools and hunt in packs. They had reminded humanity of something their ancestors knew well. If you wanted to survive in a hostile universe, you had to be more dangerous than anything trying to kill you. Dr. Song Mina, head of the newly created Psychological Warfare Division, had spent years studying alien cultures and psychology. She understood that most species fought according to rules and traditions developed over thousands of years. They had codes of honor, limitations on acceptable targets, concepts of proportionate response. Humans had evolved differently. They had survived by being adaptable, by changing tactics when old ones failed, by never giving up no matter how hopeless things seemed. Most importantly, they had learned that in a real fight there were no rules except survival. The first human response came exactly 1 month after Ji-won's death. A Valix patrol ship simply disappeared near the edge of their territory. No distress signal, no wreckage, no survivors. The official investigation concluded it was probably a mechanical failure or pirate attack, though they could not explain why pirates would completely destroy a valuable ship instead of capturing it. What the investigators did not know was that the patrol ship had been taken intact by human special forces using new stealth technology. The crew had been interrogated. for intelligence about Valak's defensive positions, then executed. The ship itself had been stripped of useful technology before being vaporized. Admiral Bakseogen, commanding the Valak's Third Fleet, read the incident reports with growing unease. Something about the complete disappearance bothered him. In his long military career, he had never seen a ship vanish so completely without leaving any trace. His concerns proved justified. 3 weeks later, a Valak's research station studying gravitational anomalies reported strange sensor readings before all communication stopped. A rescue fleet found the station intact but empty. Its crew of 200 scientists and support staff had simply vanished. More disturbing was what they found in the main laboratory, a small book of Korean poetry placed carefully on the central workstation. The investigators recognized it immediately. It was the same book Kim Ji-won had been reading when he was murdered. The message was clear and terrifying. Someone had taken an entire research station crew without leaving a trace, and they wanted the Valaks to know that this was connected to the murdered diplomat. Fear began to spread through Valak space for the first time in centuries. They were facing an enemy that could strike anywhere, disappear without a trace, and leave behind calling cards that proved this was all planned. The humans were not responding with angry speeches or diplomatic protests. They were responding with actions that defied everything. The Valaks thought they knew about their capabilities. The war had begun, and the Valaks were already losing. 6 months had passed since the murder of Kim Ji-won, and the Valaks Empire was beginning to understand they had made a terrible mistake. The disappearance of patrol ships and research stations was no longer dismissed as accidents or piracy. Even the most arrogant Valaks military leaders were starting to admit they faced an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. General Ko Wanbin stood in the command center of the human battleship Vengeance, watching real-time reports flow in from across Valak space. His Ghost Protocol operatives had infiltrated 12 Valak systems and were systematically gathering intelligence on military installations, defensive positions, and fleet movements. The information they collected painted a picture of an empire that was powerful but complacent. The Valaks had not fought a real war in over a century. Their tactics were outdated, their commanders inexperienced, their troops trained for ceremonial duties rather than actual combat. They had grown, soft from decades of technological superiority over younger species. Captain Ojisu, commander of the stealth destroyer Shadow, received her orders through encrypted channels. The target was a Valak's military academy on one of their core worlds. The facility trained their elite officer corps and was considered absolutely secure, protected by orbital defense platforms and garrisoned by their best troops. It had never been successfully attacked, but the humans were not planning an attack. They had spent months studying Valak psychology and culture. What they discovered was a species obsessed with honor and status. A public humiliation would be far more damaging than a simple military defeat. The Academy was hosting its graduation ceremony when the human ships arrived. The entire Valak's military command structure was present to honor the newest officers. Admirals, generals, fleet, commanders all gathered in one place to celebrate their traditions. The human stealth ships slipped past the orbital defenses undetected. New cloaking technology, reverse-engineered from captured Valak's equipment, made them invisible to enemy sensors. They took positions throughout the system and waited for the signal. When the attack began, it was swift and devastating. Every orbital defense platform was destroyed simultaneously. Every Valak ship in the system was reduced to debris in a matter of minutes. The Academy itself was left untouched, but the entire Valak's military leadership found themselves trapped on the surface with no way to escape. Then came the broadcast transmitted on every Valak's communication channel. A human voice speaking perfect Valak's delivered a simple message. You killed a man who came in peace. We remember this is only the beginning. The psychological impact was immediate and catastrophic. If humans could penetrate their most secure system, destroy their defenses, and trap their military leaders at will, then nowhere was safe. The carefully constructed image of Valak's invincibility crumbled in a single day. High Admiral Vortex, Supreme Commander of all Valak's military forces, was among those trapped on the Academy grounds. He had dismissed human capabilities as primitive and crude. Now he watched human ships patrol his system with complete impunity while he huddled in what had been considered the most secure facility in Valak's space. Dr. Song Mina monitored the Valak's communications networks from her command ship and smiled with cold satisfaction. The enemy was reacting exactly as her psychological profiles had predicted. They were confused, frightened, and increasingly desperate. Fear would make them make mistakes, and mistakes could be exploited. The fourth strike came 2 weeks later. A Valak supply convoy carrying advanced weapons to their frontier fleets simply vanished between star systems. One day, satellite tracking showed 12 cargo ships escorted by 6 warships. The next day, there was nothing but empty space. What the Valaks did not know was that the convoy had been captured intact using a new technology that could disable ship engines without destroying them. The crews were taken prisoner. The weapons were studied and reverse-engineered, and the intelligence gathered from ship computers revealed the locations of secret Valak's military installations. Admiral Lee Soman studied the captured technology in her laboratory aboard the human dreadnought Retribution. The Valak's plasma weapons were impressive, but they had critical weaknesses that could be exploited. Their shield systems were powerful, but they had frequency vulnerabilities that could be targeted. Human engineers were already developing countermeasures that would make Valak's defenses useless. The fifth attack targeted the Valak's homeworld itself. Human infiltration teams, using captured Valak's identity documents and biological disguises, walked openly through their capital city. They planted surveillance devices in government buildings, military headquarters, and communication centers. Within days, human intelligence agencies knew every Valak's military secret. But the infiltrators left behind more than just spy equipment. They also left evidence of their presence. Copies of Kim Ji-won's poetry book appeared in the personal offices of every major Valak's leader. The message was clear. Humans could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. Panic began to spread through the Valak's government chancellor. Vex, the moderate leader who had worked with Ji-won, was overthrown by hardliners who demanded immediate military action against human space. But their own military leaders were paralyzed by fear. How could they attack an enemy that seemed to know their every move before they made it? The sixth strike was the most audacious, yet a human fleet appeared in the Valak's home system and engaged their entire first fleet in open battle. What shocked Valak's observers was not that the humans attacked, but how they fought. They used Valak's weapons captured from previous raids. They employed tactics that seemed to anticipate every Valak's counter-move. They demonstrated technologies that the Valaks thought were still experimental. Captain Nam Gi-hyun, commanding the human battleship Justice, watched Valak's ships explode under fire from their own weapons. The irony was not lost on him. These aliens had murdered a diplomat who came seeking peace. Now they were being destroyed by their own technology, turned against them. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, half. The Valak's first fleet was destroyed, and the survivors were in full retreat. Human losses were minimal thanks to intelligence gathered from captured ships and the psychological advantage of fighting an increasingly demoralized enemy. But the most shocking moment came when the Valak's flagship tried to surrender. Admiral Orcs, the same military leader who had ordered Ji-won's assassination, broadcast a message asking for terms. The human response was transmitted on all frequencies for everyone in the system to hear. You don't get to ask for mercy. You made this personal when you killed an innocent man. Now live with the consequences. The human fleet withdrew after the battle, but they left behind a clear message. The Valak's empire was no longer safe anywhere. The species that had considered themselves the masters of this region of space were now prey being hunted by predators. They had foolishly awakened. In human space, the news of each victory was celebrated with quiet satisfaction, rather than the wild parties that might have followed military success against other enemies. These victories were marked by somber remembrance ceremonies. The phrase, "Remember G1," accompanied every report, every celebration, every moment of triumph. This was not a war of conquest or territorial expansion. This was justice being delivered with methodical precision to those who had chosen to murder a peacemaker. And the Valaks were beginning to understand that humanity had far more terrible weapons, still unused. The Valaks Empire was dying, and its leaders knew it. 6 months of systematic humiliation had shattered their military confidence, destroyed their sense of security, and turned their own people against them. The moderate government that had once negotiated with humans was gone, replaced by hardliners who believed only extreme action could save their species. General Orcs, now supreme military commander of what remained of Valak's forces, made a decision that would seal his people's fate, unable to strike. Effectively, at the human military forces that had embarrassed him, he would target something the humans could not protect: their civilian colonies. The mining settlement on Epsilon Indi was home to 3,000 human colonists, families who had left Earth seeking better lives among the stars. They grew food in underground farms, extracted rare minerals from asteroid belts, and raised their children under alien suns. They had no military defenses because they posed no threat to anyone. The attack came without warning. 6 Valaks warships dropped out of hyperspace and immediately began orbital bombardment. The colonists had no time to evacuate, no chance to surrender, no opportunity to defend themselves. Plasma beams designed to crack. Open battleships turned homes into molten craters. Schools became funeral pyres. Community centers where families gathered for celebrations were reduced to ash and twisted metal. Sarah Chen, age 7, was playing in the colony park when the first bombs fell. Her parents, Kim and David, were working in the mineral processing plant. Her older brother Marcus was at school studying for his mathematics exam. None of them lived to see the sunset. The attack lasted only 20 minutes. When it was over, 3,000 human beings were dead, and the colony that had taken 15 years to build was nothing but glowing ruins. The Valaks ships departed immediately, broadcasting a message to all human settlements. This is what happens when you challenge. Your superiors submit or share their fate. President Park Min-ho received the news while meeting with his cabinet. The images transmitted by automated systems showed families who had died while eating dinner. Children whose toys had melted into unrecognizable shapes, emergency shelters that had been deliberately targeted to maximize casualties. For the first time since becoming president, Park wept openly in front of his advisors. These were not soldiers who had died in battle. These were teachers, farmers, engineers, people whose only crime was being human. The Valaks had crossed a line that civilized species were not supposed to cross. The response fleet, commanded by Admiral Cho Sunwoo, arrived at Epsilon Indi 12 hours later. What they found there changed everything. The systematic targeting of civilians, the complete destruction of non-military facilities, the evidence of families murdered while trying to flee to safety. All of it was recorded and transmitted to every human settlement in. Known Space Captain Nam Gi-yun walked through the ruins with his investigation team. The heat from the orbital bombardment was still making the metal structures glow in places. They found the remains of the colony school where 43 children had been in class when the attack began. They found the medical center where doctors and nurses had died trying to treat the first wave of casualties. They found the daycare center where the youngest children had been playing. Each discovery was another nail in the coffin of any hope for restraint or mercy. The colonists had not been given a chance to evacuate. They had been murdered deliberately and with calculated cruelty. The Valaks wanted to send a message about what happened when humans defied their authority. The message they actually sent was very different. Within hours of the investigation reports reaching Earth, the last restrictions on human military response were lifted. President Park addressed the United Human Federation. With images of the dead colonists displayed behind him, his speech was broadcast to every human world, every space station, every ship. "They have shown us what they truly are," he said with tears streaming down his face. "Monsters who murder children to make political points. Cowards who target the defenseless when they cannot defeat our military. We will show them what we are in return." The formal declaration of total war that followed was signed not just by Earth's government, but by every human, colony, every ship, captain, every settlement leader across human space. The document was simple and direct. The Valix Empire has chosen to wage war against human civilians. Therefore, the Valix Empire will cease to exist. Dr. Yang Yonji, head of the Human Research Collective, received unlimited funding and authorization to deploy weapons that had been considered too dangerous for use. The Omega program moved from theoretical research to active deployment planet-killing weapons that could destabilize. Matter itself were loaded onto human warships. But the most significant change was happening in the hearts and minds of ordinary humans, the species that had created poetry, music, literature, that had built gardens on airless moons and dreamed of peaceful contact with alien life, was remembering older, deeper instincts. They were remembering that their ancestors had conquered a world full of creatures, larger, stronger, and faster than themselves. They were remembering that humans did not just fight battles. They fought wars with a cold, methodical patience that could last for generations. They were remembering that their species had driven megafauna to extinction, not through superior strength, but through superior determination. The memorial service for the Epsilon Indi colonists was held on Earth, but was attended virtually by humans throughout known space. The names of all 3,000 dead were read aloud, including little Sarah Chen, who had been playing in the park when the bombs fell. The service ended with a moment of silence, followed by the same phrase spoken simultaneously by billions of human voices. Remember G1. Remember Epsilon Indi. Never forgive. Never forget. The Valix Empire monitored the human broadcasts with growing alarm. The response they had hoped for was submission, terror, a willingness to negotiate from a position of weakness. Instead, they saw a species united in cold fury, preparing for what human leaders were openly calling a war of extinction. High Chancellor Brex, who had replaced the murdered Vex, tried to open diplomatic channels, offering to negotiate reparations for the colonial massacre. His messages were returned, unread. Human diplomats refused to meet with Valix representatives. The message from Earth was simple and final. There is nothing to discuss. The final human ultimatum was broadcast to every Valix world simultaneously. It came not from political leaders or military commanders, but from the families of those who had died. A woman whose sister had been killed at Epsilon Indi spoke for all of humanity. "You murdered our peacemaker when he came offering friendship. You slaughtered our families when we responded to your crimes. You have chosen to be monsters, so we will treat you as monsters deserve to be treated. You will receive no mercy, no quarter, no second chances. Your empire will fall, and your species will remember for 1,000 generations why you should never have tested human patience." The war that followed would be remembered as the moment when the galaxy learned that there were some lines civilized species should never cross, and they learned that humanity, despite all their talk of peace and diplomacy, were very, very good at teaching that lesson to those foolish enough to test them. 1 year after the Epsilon Indi massacre, the Valix Empire controlled 12 star systems, commanded 3,000 warships, and ruled over a population of 15 billion. They had allies among other species who feared human aggression more than Valix arrogance. Their technology remained superior in most areas, and their manufacturing capacity still exceeded human production. None of it would save them. Admiral Cho Sun-woo, now commanding the entire human war effort, had spent the year studying every aspect of Valek's military doctrine. Every battle, every tactical decision, every strategic choice made in the past century had been analyzed, cataloged, and turned into data that could be used against them. What she found was a species that had grown soft through centuries of technological superiority. They fought like generals from an earlier era, relying on overwhelming force and better equipment to guarantee victory. They followed predictable patterns, used standard formations, and never adapted their tactics to face an unexpected enemy. Humans fought differently. They fought like a species that had climbed to the top of their world's food chain, not through strength or speed, but through intelligence adaptation and the absolute refusal to give up. They fought like persistence, hunters who would chase their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. They fought to win, and winning meant the complete destruction of anything that threatened their families. The decisive battle came at Kepler 442b, the same system where Kim Ji-won had been murdered. The Valeks assembled their largest fleet in history, 2,000 ships commanded by Admiral Korex himself, the same general who had ordered the Diplomat's assassination. They expected a final confrontation where superior numbers and firepower would crush human resistance once and for all. They found instead an enemy that had spent a year preparing for exactly this moment. Human ships modified with captured Valeks technology appeared throughout the system, using stealth systems so advanced they were invisible until they opened fire. The Valeks fleet found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to know their every move before they made it. Ships that should have been outgunned and outnumbered struck from impossible angles using weapons that turned Valek's shields into useless decorations. Captain Oji-soo commanding the human flagship. Retribution watched as enemy ships died by the hundreds. Each explosion was not just a tactical victory, but a step closer to justice for every innocent human who had died. The children of Epsilon Indi, the research teams who had been murdered, the diplomat who had only wanted peace. The Valeks formation broke apart as panic spread through. Their ranks ships that had fought together for decades turned and fled rather than face weapons that could erase them from existence. Admiral Korex tried desperately to maintain order, but his communications were being jammed by human electronic warfare systems that had been designed specifically to counter Valek's equipment. The turning point came when the human ships deployed their new Omega weapons for the first time. These were not nuclear bombs or antimatter warheads, but something far more terrible devices that could destabilize the quantum vacuum itself, creating expanding zones where matter simply ceased to exist. The first Omega weapon detonated in the center of the Valeks formation, and 300 ships simply vanished, destroyed, not reduced to wreckage but erased from reality as if they had never existed. The explosion was visible from planets in neighboring systems, a brief impossible star that shone for moments before disappearing into nothingness. The remaining Valeks ships did not retreat. They fled in complete panic, broadcasting surrender offers, ceasefire requests, anything that might stop the weapons that could unmake reality itself. But the human response was the same message that had been sent for over a year. Remember G1. Remember Epsilon. Indi. No surrender. No mercy. No forgiveness. Admiral Korex made one final desperate attempt to save his fleet. He broadcast a personal message to Admiral Cho, offering to surrender himself if she would spare his remaining ships. He promised trials for war criminals, reparations for human losses, anything she wanted in exchange for ending the slaughter. Her response was transmitted on all frequencies for every ship in the system to hear, "You had your chance to be reasonable when our diplomat came in peace. You chose murder instead. You had your chance to follow the laws of war when we responded with military action. You chose to slaughter children instead. Now you face the consequences of your choices. The battle ended when the last Valak ship was destroyed by weapons that left no wreckage, no survivors, no evidence they had ever existed. The most powerful fleet in Valak's history had been erased in 6 hours of fighting, human casualties numbered in the hundreds, while Valak's losses exceeded 1,800 ships, but the Battle of Kepler 442b was only the beginning. The human war machine that had been building for over a year was finally unleashed upon an enemy that had lost the will to fight. Fleet after fleet of human warships equipped with reality-destroying weapons swept through Valak's space, meeting little organized resistance. Dr. Kim Hyejin, monitoring the advance from the human command ship, watched as the Omega weapons were deployed. Against military targets throughout the Empire, each use of the weapons was carefully calculated to destroy Valak's military capability while leaving civilian populations alive but isolated, cut off from interstellar travel and reduced to pre-industrial technology on their home worlds. The Valaks tried one last desperate gambit. They appealed to their allies for help, painting the humans as dangerous madmen who threatened all galactic civilization. But the other species had watched the war with growing horror. The humans had demonstrated weapons that could literally erase fleets from existence. Who would be next if they decided another species needed to be taught a lesson? No help came. The Valak's empire found itself alone, facing an enemy that seemed to have unlimited resources, unlimited patience, and weapons that defied all known laws of physics. Their military was being systematically destroyed, their territory was being occupied, and their government was collapsing into chaos. The end came not with a great final battle, but with a whimper. The last Valak's military installation was a research facility on a moon orbiting their homeworld. It was defended by a handful of obsolete ships and manned by scientists who had never trained for combat. Admiral Lee So-min, the old veteran who had been moved to tears by Jiwon's death, personally oversaw its destruction. The facility was erased by an Omega weapon, leaving behind only empty space where it had once stood. The war was over. The Valak's empire, that had once controlled 12 star systems and commanded thousands of ships, had been reduced to scattered settlements on isolated worlds. Their military was completely destroyed. Their government had collapsed and their population was too traumatized to resist. The final casualty count was staggering. Over 1 billion Valak's military personnel dead, thousands of ships destroyed, entire fleets erased from existence. The empire that had thought itself superior to humanity had been exterminated as a spacefaring power in less than 2 years. The message to the galaxy was clear and terrifying. Humanity would extend friendship to those who deserved it. They would show mercy to those who asked for it. But they would never forget a wrong, and they would never forgive the murder of those who died trying to build a better universe. The Valaks had learned too late that there was something far more dangerous than superior technology or larger fleets. There was the fury of a species that remembered every insult, every betrayal, every act of cruelty committed against them. And there was the patience of predators who would hunt their prey across light years and decades until justice was finally served. The Galactic Council emergency session was called exactly 72 hours after the last Valak's military installation was erased from existence. Representatives from 47 species gathered in the great circular chamber that had once seemed so impressive to human diplomats. Now the same chamber felt smaller, somehow diminished by the knowledge that one of its member species had been completely destroyed as a spacefaring power ambassador. Yang Minji walked into the chamber representing humanity, for the first time since Kim Ji-won had been murdered. The other delegates avoided looking at her directly. Their conversation stopped when she passed. Fear hung in the air like smoke. Everyone had seen the recordings from the Battle of Kepler 442b. Everyone had watched ships simply cease to exist when human weapons touched them. The session began with the Thoranian representative calling for what he termed a discussion of proportional response. The tall, blue-skinned alien spoke, carefully choosing his words with diplomatic precision. The human retaliation, he claimed, had exceeded all reasonable bounds in response to what he called a regrettable diplomatic incident. Species after species rose to echo similar sentiments. They spoke of the need for restraint, for understanding, for the kind of measured response that civilized beings employed when conflicts arose. The Zephyrian delegate actually used the phrase excessive force when describing humanity's destruction of the Valak's military. Yang Minji listened to 46 different species lecture her about proportionality, while not one of them mentioned Kim Ji-won by name. Not one acknowledged that he had been murdered while seeking peace. Not one condemned the massacre of 3,000 civilians at Epsilon Indi. They spoke as if the war had begun with human aggression rather than Valak's brutality. When her turn came to speak, Yang stood slowly and looked around the chamber at beings who had dismissed humanity. For decades, the same aliens who had treated human diplomats like amusing pets now wanted to lecture her about proper behavior in warfare. "You want to discuss proportionality?" she said in a voice that carried clearly through the vast chamber. A single human diplomat tried to build peace between our species. You allowed his killers to walk free. A human colony was murdered in response to our legitimate military actions. You called for restraint and understanding. Now you are afraid because we won. A war that was declared on us by people who thought we were too weak to fight back. The silence that followed was absolute. Yang continued speaking, but her words were no longer directed at the council. They were being broadcast live to human settlements. Throughout known space, to colonies that had listened to alien species, dismissed their worth for generations. The time for asking permission is over. The time for seeking approval from species who see us as inferior is finished. You had centuries to treat us as equals. You chose not to. You had the chance to demand justice for our murdered diplomat. You chose silence. You had the opportunity to condemn the massacre of our civilians. You chose neutrality. Ambassador Vorthak of the ancient Celestan. Hegemony tried to interrupt, calling for order and proper diplomatic procedure. Yang ignored him completely. "We are withdrawing from the Galactic Council, effective immediately. We will establish our own trade networks, our own alliances, our own rules for how civilized beings should behave toward each other. Any species that wishes to deal with humanity will do so on terms of absolute equality or not at all." The chamber erupted in voices demanding explanations, justifications, some kind of negotiation that would keep humanity within the established order. Yang gathered her materials and walked toward the exit, but stopped at the threshold. "And understand this clearly," she said, turning back to face the assembled delegates. "We have shown you what happens when someone murders our peacemakers and slaughters our families." The Valak's Empire learned that lesson in the most final way possible. Any species considering similar actions should study their fate carefully, because we never forget and we never forgive. The door sealed behind her with a sound like finality itself. Meanwhile, in what had once been Valak space, the aftermath of humanity's fury was becoming clear. The 12 worlds that had once been the heart of an interstellar empire were now isolated islands cut off from faster-than-light travel and reduced to whatever technology they could maintain locally. On the Valak's homeworld, former High Chancellor Bex stared out at cities that would never again see ships from other stars. The orbital shipyards that had built fleets capable of crossing the galaxy were empty, twisted metal. The communication arrays that had once coordinated an empire spanning multiple star systems were silent wreckage. The human occupation forces were not cruel. They provided medical aid when asked, delivered food supplies to worlds facing starvation, and even helped repair essential infrastructure. But they made it clear that the Valaks would never again travel between the stars. The species that had considered themselves superior to humanity would spend the rest of their existence confined to their birth worlds. Dr. Song Mina supervised the psychological evaluation teams that studied Valak's survivors. The reports painted a picture of a broken, people traumatized by the completeness of their defeat. Many spoke of nightmares about weapons that could erase matter from existence, about enemies who seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish like ghosts. But what disturbed the survivors most was not the advanced human technology or even the devastating weapons. It was the cold, methodical way humans had pursued their vengeance. Every action had been calculated. Every strike had served a strategic purpose. The war had not been fought in anger, but with the patient determination of hunters who would never stop pursuing their prey. Admiral Lee Soman, now serving as military governor of the former Valak's territories, met with the remnants of their government to explain the terms of what humans were calling the final peace. The agreement was simple and non-negotiable. The Valaks would remain on their worlds. They would rebuild their societies within the constraints of pre-interstellar technology, and they would teach their children exactly why their empire had fallen. The story of Kim Ji-won, the diplomat who had come seeking friendship only to be murdered by those who saw humans as inferior, would be taught in every Valak school. The massacre at Epsilon Indi would be remembered as the moment their species chose to become monsters rather than civilized beings. The complete destruction of their military would serve as a permanent reminder of what happened when someone tested human patience. President Park Min-ho addressed the human nation for the final time regarding the war. His speech was broadcast from the memorial garden that had been built at the site where Kim Ji-won's body had been returned to Earth. Thousands of flowering trees from dozens of worlds created a living monument to the man whose death had changed galactic history. "We did not want this war," he said, standing beside the simple gravestone that bore only Ji-won's name and the word peacemaker. "We extended our hand in friendship, and they answered with violence. We offered them our best, and they sent us back his body. We gave them every chance to choose a different path, and they chose cruelty instead." The memorial garden was filled with families of those who had died at Epsilon Indi, representatives from every human world and veterans of the war that had reshaped the galaxy. Children played among the flowering trees, unaware that their peaceful games were only possible because their species had demonstrated they were the most dangerous predators. In known space, the war crimes tribunals that followed were conducted by humans according to human standards of justice. Former Valak's military leaders were tried for the murder of civilians, the assassination of diplomats, and what human lawyers termed crimes against the basic decency that should exist between intelligent species. General Orcs, the architect of both Ji-won's assassination and the Epsilon Indi massacre, was found guilty on all charges. The sentence was exile to a barren world where he would spend his remaining years alone with the knowledge that his decisions had doomed his entire species to permanent isolation from the galactic community. But the most significant change was not in what happened to the Valaks, but in how other species began to treat humanity. Invitations to diplomatic meetings that had once been grudgingly extended were now accompanied by elaborate expressions of respect. Trade negotiations that had once favored alien partners now recognized human interests as equally important. The galaxy had learned a lesson that would be remembered for millennia. There was a young species that looked fragile and peaceful, one that created art and music and poetry, one that sent diplomats seeking friendship rather than conquest. But underneath that civilized exterior was something far older and more dangerous. When pushed too far, when their peacemakers were murdered and their families slaughtered, they would respond with a fury that could erase empires from existence. Ambassador Kim Ji-won had wanted his children to meet alien children and learn about different cultures. Instead, his death had taught every species in the galaxy the most important lesson about human culture. They were capable of incredible kindness and devastating vengeance, and the choice of which face of humanity you encountered was entirely up to you. The flowering trees in the memorial garden bloomed year after year, fed by soil that contained the ashes of those who had died seeking peace. Their beauty served as a reminder that humans could create life and wonder anywhere they went, but they also served as a warning to anyone who might consider tease.